On the evening of the 5th of June, 1944, every American paratrooper who boarded a C-47 and headed toward Normandy was carrying between 90 to 150 pounds of gear. A rifle, grenades, ammunition, explosives, rations, parachute, and reserve chute, all strapped, buckled, and taped to his body, making each soldier struggle to move, barely able to walk. Some men required assistance from their comrades to board the planes. They would leap from an altitude of only 600 feet, barely enough height for their parachutes to open fully, and they would jump into total darkness, above a peninsula that the Germans had intentionally flooded. The planners on the Allied side had already calculated the risks. Air Marshal Lee Mallory, the Allied air commander, had written to Eisenhower warning him that the mission could result in the loss of up to half of the paratroopers and as many as 70% of the glider troops. He bluntly referred to this as the potential futile slaughter of 2 fine divisions. Despite this grim prediction, the Allied High Command approved the mission. By the end of the 6th of June, nearly 2,500 of the 13,400 paratroopers who had jumped were either killed, wounded, or missing. In the 82nd Airborne Division, 15 out of the 16 battalion commanders in the infantry regiments were either killed or wounded on that single day. After 24 hours, divisional headquarters could account for only about 1/3 of the men who had jumped. But the history books rarely talk about the specifics of what those first few hours really looked like. Not the strategic successes, not the flags raised or the towns liberated, but what it cost the men who had no choice but to jump into the unknown. The plan had been meticulously prepared. 13,000 American paratroopers from the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions were to drop into the Cottonton Peninsula around 1 a.m., 5 hours before the beach landings. Their mission was clear: seize the causeways off Utah Beach, secure road junctions, neutralize German artillery positions, and stop German armored units from reaching the coast and crushing the amphibious landings before they could even get off the beach. Failure in this mission would mean that the soldiers waiting on Utah Beach could be pinned down and destroyed. The 82nd Division was to land inland west of the Murderay River and hold the western approaches. The 101st Division would take the coastal causeways. Both divisions had trained extensively for this moment. They knew their targets, their maps, and their objectives. On paper, everything was planned out. But there were 3 key problems the mission couldn't fully account for. First, there was the issue of cloud cover. A massive bank of clouds formed over the Cottonton Peninsula, so thick that pilots could not make out the ground, couldn't maintain formation, and in many cases, couldn't even identify their drop zones from the air. But the order was clear. They were to drop on schedule, no matter what. Second was the German flak. Anti-aircraft batteries from the enemy opened fire with everything they had. Planes swerved, climbed, and dove to avoid being hit. Many pilots, having been struck by flak, dropped their paratroopers early, sometimes miles before they even reached their assigned drop zones. These men found themselves jumping in total darkness, unsure if they were 5 miles or 15 miles from their target. The third issue was water. The Germans had opened the locks at Cranton weeks before at high tide, flooding hundreds of acres of lowlands. Patches of grass were still visible above the water's surface, so reconnaissance planes hadn't detected the full extent of the flooding. The maps showed dry fields, but the paratroopers who landed in those fields found themselves knee-deep in water, some even chest-deep or completely submerged. The parachute harnesses had no quick-release mechanism, so a man caught in deep water had to undo each buckle in the dark, all while the weight of his gear dragged him deeper. At 1:40 in the morning, the first men from the 82nd Airborne's 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment began dropping on Smegel. The problem was they weren't supposed to be there. A house on the edge of the town square had been set on fire by a stray incendiary bomb dropped earlier that night. The fire attracted the villagers, along with German soldiers who gathered around the square to fight the flames. The square was brightly lit. As the C-47s came in, the paratroopers dropped directly into the square, illuminated against the night sky as they fell. They couldn't maneuver, couldn't fight back, and had no way to stop their descent. German soldiers, already in position, shot at them while they were still in the air. Some men were shot and killed before they even reached the ground. Others, unable to untangle themselves from their parachutes, were shot as they struggled to free themselves. And one of the men who survived that hellish descent was Private John Steele. He was hit by flak before hitting the ground. His parachute caught on a spire of the 12th century church, leaving him suspended. Wounded in the foot, unable to cut himself free because he had lost his knife during the descent, Steele hung there for 2 hours, pretending to be dead, watching his fellow soldiers perish in the square below. The man who landed directly at his feet, Sergeant John Ray, was shot in the stomach by a German soldier moments after touching down. In total, 12 men from his unit were either killed, wounded, or captured in the square that night. Ray was one of the few to make it out alive, but most of those who landed in that square did not survive. The experience at Smegel was a visible horror. something with a face, a name, and a church steeple that still honors John Steele. But the events that unfolded in the dark, flooded fields outside the town were less visible, and in many ways, even worse. Across the Cottonton Peninsula, paratroopers dropped into every kind of terrain imaginable. Some were tangled in the thick hedgerows, unable to free themselves from their parachutes in the dense foliage. Others found themselves in waist-deep water, or even deeper, with their gear dragging them down. The time pressure was brutal. Dozens of men drowned in those fields that night. The official records are careful to say only a few drowned, but veterans who lived to tell the tale described watching their comrades sink and never come back up. The swollen Merritt River claimed men whose only mistake was landing 200 yards off course. Half of the 57th and 58th Parachute Infantry Regiments of the 82nd Division landed outside their assigned zones, often far from their targets. As a result, these men found themselves isolated in enemy territory. After 24 hours, the 101st Division headquarters could account for fewer than half its men. Just 16% of the 101st paratroopers reached their designated assembly points. This is the detail that often gets glossed over when people talk about D-Day. Not because the paratroopers failed, but because they didn't. They adapted in ways that defied the expectations of their superiors. But those adaptations required every man to face a personal, often solitary horror. Not knowing where he was, not knowing where his unit was, not knowing whether the men around him were from his division or from a completely different one. The terrain was challenging. The bocage, a landscape made up of centuries-old hedgerows, divided the Cottonton Peninsula into isolated boxes. You could be within 50 yards of another group of Americans and have no idea they were there. You could hear the voices of Germans in a field next to yours, but not be able to figure out where they were or in which direction they were moving. The only way to tell friend from foe was with small metal clickers, a tool each paratrooper carried to signal their allies. 1 click, 2 clicks back. If there was nothing in response, you were on your own. Men who had landed far from their drop zones fought their way through the darkness toward whatever target seemed closest. Colonels led men from different regiments on missions that had never been planned. Privates, suddenly the senior soldiers, took it upon themselves to launch attacks when they realized orders weren't coming. Men from the 82nd Division led men from the 101st Division on missions neither regiment had been assigned. In those first hours, the only qualification for leadership was being alive and knowing which direction was north. Some soldiers wandered behind German lines for up to 5 days before eventually linking up with friendly forces. Many others, scattered and disconnected from their units, were swiftly captured or eliminated by small German patrols, as described in a later Air Force historical study. These German units had one major advantage over the isolated Americans: coherence. The equipment, such as mortars, machine guns, radios, and anti-tank weapons, had been dropped separately in containers. These bundles were scattered across miles of flooded terrain, and many of the men had nothing more than their rifles and grenades, the gear they had jumped with during the first day of combat. The supply drops were simply too far out of reach, stuck in flooded fields that the soldiers couldn't locate. By the time June 6th dawned, it was clear that the airborne operation had not gone as planned. The question was no longer whether the mission had been executed according to the blueprint. It hadn't. Instead, it was whether the men who had survived the harrowing jump could still do enough from wherever they had landed to prevent the failure of the beach landings. The 82nd Airborne Division fought relentlessly for 33 consecutive days in Normandy, without reinforcements or replacements. When they were finally pulled back to England in mid-July, the division had lost 46% of its strength, with 5 to 245 men either killed, wounded, or missing in action. Major General Matthew Ridgway's post-battle report read, 3 days of fighting without relief, without replacements, every mission accomplished. No ground gained was ever relinquished. The 101st Airborne Division also faced immense losses. By June 30th, they had sustained 4,670 casualties. Air Marshal Lee Mallory had warned Eisenhower of the potential for catastrophic losses, but the decision was made to proceed with the operation. Eisenhower overruled the warning twice, and it is said that he wept when the last plane finally took off. The paratroopers, however, were not privy to these casualty projections. All they knew was that their mission was dangerous, that some would not make it back, and that they had to jump anyway. They checked their harnesses, adjusted their gear, and waited for the green light. The mission, for them, was a simple reality. They had volunteered knowing the risks, fully aware that some would die, and they had a job to do, regardless of the outcome. For the men in command, there was no belief that the operation would succeed as initially planned. It was a gamble, whether the catastrophe could buy enough time for the beach landings to succeed. That was the bet made with the lives of 13,400 men. These men, who had volunteered for the Airborne Division, believed in something bigger than their own survival. When they leaped, they didn't land in a well-coordinated, carefully planned mission. Instead, they faced flooded fields, wrong drop zones, malfunctioning harnesses, and the uncertainty of whether the man next to them was an ally or an enemy. What awaited them was the flooded darkness, the wrong fields, the harness that wouldn't release, and the hedgerows that trapped them. Most of them fought alone or in small, improvised groups, trying to make sense of the situation. The equipment, scattered across miles of flooded land, was nowhere to be found. Their unit was nowhere in sight. And yet, despite the chaos, they fought on, not because the plan was working, but because the men landing on Utah Beach needed them to secure the roads for their advance. In St. Marigold's, the monument still displays a mannequin suspended from a church spire, representing Private John Steele, who hung there for 2 hours, his foot wounded, watching his comrades die below him. The statue marks a strange form of remembrance, one that captures the horror rather than the victory. It is fitting, though, because the airborne operation of Normandy was both a tragic failure in execution and a strategic success. The tactical disaster achieved its objectives, but at a heavy cost, one that those who planned it had already accepted before the first plane had even left England. The 82nd Division's record from those 33 days isn't captured in the monument. It's found in Ridgway's after-action report. 33 days without relief, without replacements, every mission accomplished, no ground relinquished. 6 words that condense a story of sacrifice, one that would take a lifetime to fully comprehend. The men who landed on the morning of June 6, 1944, whether they made it or not, were not following a plan. The plan had shattered the moment they hit the ground. What they found was uncertainty, confusion, and isolation. They fought with whatever they had, wherever they had landed, toward a beach they couldn't see, for men they had never met. That's what D-Day truly cost, long before a single American soldier set foot on the sand. The price of the victory, hidden behind the monuments, is paid by those who gave everything on the ground. Paratroopers from 2 different aircrafts were directly dropped into a town square that had been illuminated by fire. As they descended at a rapid speed of 10 to 12 feet per second, they were unable to adjust their positions, defend themselves, or slow their fall. German soldiers opened fire while they were still airborne. Some were killed mid-air, others as soon as they landed, tangled in their parachutes, helpless and unable to escape in time. Private John Steele was one of those unlucky enough to be struck by flak before hitting the ground. His parachute became entangled in one of the spires of the church, leaving him hanging with a foot injury. His knife had slipped from him during the fall, leaving him with no way to cut himself free. For 2 hours, he remained suspended in the dark, pretending to be dead, while he watched his comrades perish below. One of the men who landed directly beneath him, Sergeant John Ray, was shot in the stomach just moments after touching down. Within seconds, 12 men from his unit were either killed, wounded, or captured. Ray was one of the few who survived. The chaos in St. Margol was a clear and visible tragedy, the one with a face and a name, symbolized by the church spire still holding a mannequin in honor of John Steele. However, what took place in the surrounding dark fields was even more devastating and less visible. Across the Cottonton Peninsula, paratroopers were dropping into every imaginable kind of terrain. In thick hedgerows, their parachutes got caught, leaving them struggling in the dark. In flooded lowlands, the heavy weight of their gear dragged them down, making it impossible to break free from the harness. In 2 feet of standing water, with nearly 100 pounds of equipment on their backs, their parachute canopies spread out over the surface above them. Time was their enemy. Many men drowned that night, though the Army's official numbers remained cautious, varying from a few to scores. Veterans who survived recounted how they watched their comrades sink beneath the water, never to resurface. The swollen Merid River, now 3 to 4 times its normal width, took men whose only mistake was landing a mere 200 yards away from their assigned drop zone. The 57th and 58th Parachute Infantry Regiments of the 82nd Airborne faced the worst of this calamity. Only 25% of the 58th Regiment landed within a mile of their target zone. Half of the regiment found themselves east of the Murderay River, on the wrong side, completely cut off from their objectives and stranded in enemy territory. By the end of the first 24 hours, the 101st Airborne Division had accounted for fewer than half of its soldiers. Only 16% of the 101st paratroopers had reached their designated assembly points. This story does not match the widely accepted image of D-Day, not because the paratroopers failed. They didn't. They adapted in ways no one could have expected. But that adaptation came at a great cost. Each soldier had to face, alone or with small makeshift groups, the overwhelming horror of not knowing where they were, not knowing where their comrades were, and not knowing whether the men they encountered were allies or enemies, all while moving in total darkness behind enemy lines. The Bocage terrain, with its ancient hedge lines made of thorns and timber, stretched across the Cottonton Peninsula in layers, creating sealed pockets. You could be mere yards away from another group of Americans and have no idea they were there. You could hear German voices just on the other side of the hedge and not know which direction they were moving in. The only way to tell if the shape moving through the darkness was an enemy or comrade was to use the crickets, small metal clickers carried by the paratroopers. 1 click meant friend, 2 clicks back meant ally. If there was no response, the soldier was left alone in the dark. Some men, having landed miles away from their intended drop zones, made their way through the darkness toward whatever objective seemed closest. Colonels found themselves leading squads made up of men from different regiments, their original orders forgotten in the chaos. Privates suddenly became the highest-ranking survivors and took the initiative to lead attacks because waiting for orders was futile. Men from the 82nd Airborne Division led men from the 101st on missions neither unit was originally tasked with. In those first hours, the only qualification for leadership was being alive and having a sense of direction. Some soldiers wandered and fought behind German lines for up to 5 days before finally reaching friendly forces. A significant number of men, scattered and without cohesion, were swiftly dealt with by small German units, as the Air Force's historical study would later put it. These German units had the advantage that the scattered Americans did not: unity. The vital equipment, like mortars, machine guns, radios, and anti-tank weapons, had been dropped in separate bundles. These containers were spread out across miles of flooded countryside, and many soldiers had nothing heavier than their rifles and grenades to fight with, as the crucial supplies remained inaccessible. By the time June 6th arrived, the focus shifted from whether the airborne plan had gone as expected, it had not, to whether the men who had survived could still do enough from wherever they had landed to prevent the amphibious assault from failing. The 82nd Airborne Division fought without relief for 33 straight days, enduring without replacements. When they were finally pulled back to England in mid-July, the division had lost 46% of its men, totaling 245, killed, wounded, or missing. Major General Matthew Ridgway's post-battle report read, 3 days of action without relief, without replacements. Every mission accomplished. No ground gained was ever relinquished. Similarly, the 101st suffered 4 670 casualties by the end of June. Air Marshal Lee Mallory had issued a warning, predicting the operation would result in catastrophic losses. Eisenhower, however, overruled him twice, accepting the risk. When the last plane took off, it is reported that Eisenhower wept. The paratroopers who boarded those planes had no idea of the full scope of the losses they would face. What they knew was that the mission was perilous, and some would not return. They checked their harnesses, adjusted their gear, and waited for the green light. No one believed the operation would succeed as planned. The only question was whether the calamity would last long enough to allow the amphibious forces to secure the beach. This operation, the sacrifice of 400 men who volunteered for the Airborne Division because they believed in something greater than their own survival, was a calculated gamble. What they encountered after jumping was far from the neat, well-coordinated strategy they had been trained for. Instead, they found themselves in flooded fields, disoriented, with equipment scattered and their units lost in the darkness of Normandy. And yet, despite everything, they fought on, not because the plan was working, but because the men coming ashore on Utah Beach needed the roads to be cleared. The monument at St. Margol, still holding the mannequin that represents John Steele, is an eerie reminder of that sacrifice. It is not just a symbol of triumph, but also a commemoration of the horror that those soldiers faced. The Normandy airborne operation was both a near disaster and a strategic success, achieved at a cost that was already accepted by those in command before the first plane had even left England. The true record of the 82nd's 33 days of fighting is not etched on the monument, but found in Ridgway's after-action report. 33 days without relief, without replacements, every mission accomplished, no ground relinquished. These 6 words encapsulate an experience that would take a lifetime to fully understand. The men who landed on the morning of June 6, 1944, did not follow a plan. The plan had already disintegrated. They fought with whatever they had, wherever they had landed, toward a beach they could not see, for men they had never met. This is what D-Day truly cost, long before any American soldier set foot on the sand. If you're here to understand the real history, the stories of the men behind the monuments, and the price of victory, stay tuned. There's more to come.